Alda is one of the world's most recognisable and beloved actors. We fell in love with him as the wisecracking surgeon Hawkeye Pierce on the hit series MASH.
He survived polio as a child, buried 2 co-stars from his own show, and stood inside a real wildfire while the cameras kept rolling. Now, at 90 years old, Alan Alda is one of only 4 original cast members still alive from the most watched scripted broadcast in American television history, and the stories he carries with him are stranger, sadder, and more human than anything that ever made it to air. This is the real story of how a small Korean War comedy became a cultural phenomenon, nearly got cancelled twice, and ended up changing television forever. Most people who grew up watching reruns of this show remember it as a war comedy with a laugh track and a bunch of doctors cracking jokes in a tent. What they don't remember, because it was never really advertised, is that the show almost didn't survive its first season, that its cast fought the network over nearly every serious storyline, and that real tragedy off-camera kept bleeding into the fictional one on screen. Alan Alda lived through every bit of it, and as he closes in on the tail end of a 7-decade career, he's talked more openly than ever about what those 11 years actually cost the people who made them. Before any of this became a television show, it was a novel written by a man who had actually lived it. Richard Hornberger served as a surgeon with a mobile army surgical hospital during the Korean War, and years later he sat down and turned his memories into fiction, publishing under the pen name Richard Hooker. The book mixed crude jokes with genuine horror because that's what Hornberger remembered from the operating tent. Doctors who laughed constantly, not because the situation was funny, but because laughing was sometimes the only thing keeping them from falling apart. That tension between comedy and trauma became the emotional backbone of everything that followed. Director Robert Altman adapted the novel into a film in 1970, and it became a genuine sensation. It won top honors at the Cannes Film Festival, earned multiple Academy Award nominations, and proved that audiences were hungry for a war story that didn't rely on simple heroics. CBS took notice and decided to gamble on turning it into a weekly series, which was a far riskier move than it sounds today. Television spin-offs of successful films rarely worked, mainly because smaller budgets made them look cheap next to the movie they were copying. On top of that, the country was in the middle of the Vietnam War, and putting a war story into people's living rooms every week felt like it could backfire badly. The writers who built the pilot made a deliberate choice early on. They weren't going to just reshoot the movie with new actors. They wanted characters who felt like real, flawed people rather than polished leading men, and they wanted to let genuine grief sit right next to genuine comedy in the same episode, which was not something network television had really attempted before. Alan Alda was cast as Captain Hawkeye Pierce, and the show premiered on September 17, 1972. Critics responded well. Audiences did not. The early ratings were rough enough that network executives started quietly preparing for the possibility that the show would be canceled before it even had a chance to find its footing. That first season is where you can actually watch the show discover what it wanted to be. In an episode titled, "Sometimes You Hear the Bullet," a young soldier who's a close friend of Hawkeye's dies on the operating table, and the camera holds on Hawkeye breaking down while he's still in his surgical scrubs. It was the first time the series let a death land with real emotional weight instead of playing it for a quick, sentimental beat, and executives were nervous that it would drive viewers away entirely. Instead, it did something more important. It told the small but loyal audience the show did have that this wasn't going to be a throwaway sitcom. But loyalty from a small audience doesn't save a show from cancellation, and the ratings stayed weak through the rest of that winter. What actually rescued the series wasn't a creative decision. It was scheduling luck. CBS ran the first season in reruns throughout the summer of 1973, and with little competition on television at that time of year, new viewers discovered the show and got hooked on characters they hadn't paid attention to the first time around. Then CBS made the move that changed everything. They slotted the show right after All in the Family, which was the most watched program in the country. Millions of people who were already sitting down for that show simply stayed on the same channel, and the ratings shot into the top 10 almost overnight. Success brought its own problems. As the audience grew, so did the creative battles behind the scenes. Producer Gene Reynolds and writer Larry Gelbart wanted to keep pushing the show toward heavier, more honest storytelling, while network executives grew increasingly uneasy about how dark some episodes had become. Internally, some CBS staff reportedly started referring to it less as a situation comedy and more as a situation tragedy, which tells you a lot about how far the show had drifted from a typical sitcom format. Censors pushed back on visible blood during surgery scenes and trimmed dialogue they considered too crude for a family audience. The fight that mattered most, though, was over the laugh track. Nearly every sitcom of that era used a canned laughter track to cue the audience on when a moment was supposed to be funny, and Gelbart and Reynolds argued furiously that playing fake laughter over scenes of doctors trying to save dying soldiers was tasteless and undercut the entire point of the show. CBS wouldn't remove the laugh track altogether, but the creative team did win one significant concession. No laugh track would ever play during scenes set inside the operating room. That single rule gave the surgical scenes a starkness that no other comedy on television had at the time, and it's part of why those moments still land the way they do decades later. Even with that win, the network continued rejecting scripts they considered too politically charged or too bleak for prime time, and the writers kept pushing anyway because the whole appeal of the project, to them, was refusing to sand down the reality of what war actually does to the people living through it. Then the cast itself started to change, and not by anyone's design. McLean Stevenson, who played the beloved commanding officer Lieutenant Colonel Henry Blake, decided he wanted to leave the ensemble to try headlining his own show. Instead of writing him a quiet, happy send-off, the writers made an unusually bold choice for network television at the time. In the season 3 finale, Henry is honorably discharged and boards a plane home. In the final minutes of the episode, Radar walks into the operating room and reads a telegram. Henry's plane went down over the Sea of Japan with no survivors. To capture authentic, unrehearsed reactions, the production reportedly kept that final twist hidden from most of the cast until shortly before they filmed it. Audiences were not prepared for it either. CBS switchboards and mailrooms were flooded with angry letters and calls from viewers who felt blindsided by the loss of a character they loved. Not long after, Wayne Rogers, who played Hawkeye's close friend Trapper John McIntyre, also left the show. Rogers reportedly felt his character had been pushed to the margins while the strongest material kept going to Alda's Hawkeye, and because he had never signed a long-term contract, he was free to walk away before the 4th season began. His exit was handled with barely more than a passing line of dialogue, a stark contrast to the emotional weight given to Henry Blake's departure. The back-to-back losses fed years of tabloid speculation about tension on set and rumors that Alda had become the show's dominant creative force at the expense of everyone else in the ensemble. Claims Alda has generally downplayed in interviews over the years, describing the environment instead as a group of actors who genuinely respected each other's work even when the show's internal politics got complicated. To fill those gaps, the production brought in Mike Farrell as B.J. Honeycutt and Harry Morgan as Colonel Potter, both of whom went on to become just as beloved as the characters they replaced. But keeping the show feeling authentic took more than just strong casting. Members of the creative team traveled to Korea to speak directly with doctors and nurses who had served in real mobile army surgical hospitals, gathering first-hand stories about overnight surgeries and the particular kind of dark humor that develops among people working under constant, brutal pressure. Those conversations shaped scripts for years afterward. Domestically, the production built its camp at Malibu Creek State Park in California, where the terrain resembled the hills of Korea closely enough to work on camera. It was not an easy place to film. Cast and crew spent long days under intense heat in heavy wool military uniforms, dealing with dust, unpredictable weather, and the general grind of outdoor location shooting year after year. Then, as the production was preparing to wrap the series entirely in 1982, a real wildfire broke out near the set and spread quickly through the dry hills, forcing everyone to evacuate. By the time firefighters contained the blaze, the outdoor set had been badly damaged. Rather than treat it purely as a disaster, the writers folded the real fire into the show's final storylines, writing scenes in which the camp has to evacuate because of a fire tearing through the area, meaning some of the smoke and destruction audiences saw on screen in the show's closing episodes was genuinely real. By the time the series reached its 11th season, it was still a ratings powerhouse, and CBS reportedly would have kept it running for years longer if the creative team had agreed to it. Alda and the rest of the producers felt differently. They didn't want the show to keep going until the writing grew stale or repetitive. They wanted to end it while it was still working on their own terms. CBS eventually agreed to a feature-length finale titled Goodbye, Farewell and Amen, which aired on February 28, 1983. Alda took on the additional role of director for the episode, wanting the ending to stay true to characters he had spent over a decade building. The finale ran nearly 2.5 hours, far longer than a standard episode, and the anticipation leading into that night was enormous. When the numbers came in, they were staggering. More than 100 million people watched the broadcast live in the United States, and when public viewing parties and gatherings are factored in, some estimates put the total audience well above 120 million. The finale pulled in a rating and audience share that meant a huge majority of televisions turned on in the country that night were tuned to the same program. It remains to this day the most watched scripted television episode in American history, a record that no show has come close to touching in the decades since, across broadcast, cable, or streaming. The story didn't end with the finale though. Reruns turned the show into an enormous, ongoing financial success for years afterward, generating hundreds of millions of dollars in syndication revenue and keeping the series in daily rotation on local stations well into the following decades. New generations discovered it on cable networks, and eventually all 251 episodes made their way onto streaming platforms, giving the entire 11-season run a permanent digital home. Beyond the money, the show fundamentally shifted what television executives believed a series could be. Before it, the conventional wisdom was that a show had to pick a lane, either a straightforward comedy with a laugh track or a serious drama, but not both in the same half hour. This series proved that a single episode could move from a genuinely funny scene straight into something devastating without losing the audience, and that blueprint became the foundation for the modern dramedy. Shows that came along decades later, built around mixing workplace comedy with real emotional stakes, owe a direct debt to the structure this series pioneered. As the years went on, attention naturally shifted toward the surviving cast. In May of 2025, fans mourned the loss of Loretta Swit, who played Major Margaret Houlihan and was one of the very few actors to appear in both the original pilot and the series finale. Her death left just 4 surviving members of the show's core cast: Alan Alda, Mike Farrell, Jamie Farr, and Gary Berghoff. Now at 90, Alda remains the actor most closely tied to the show in the public imagination. He's given countless interviews over the decades, and conversations still tend to circle back to those 11 years in a fictional Korean War medical unit, regardless of what else he's accomplished since. And he's accomplished plenty, from an Emmy-winning run on The West Wing to an Oscar-nominated performance in The Aviator. But when asked what the show actually means to him, Alda rarely points to ratings records or syndication numbers. He talks instead about the strangers who stop him on the street, unprompted, to tell him that watching Hawkeye Pierce push through exhaustion to save lives in that operating room is part of what convinced them to go into medicine themselves. For Alda, hearing that a character written to entertain people on a Monday night ended up shaping real careers in real hospitals is the part of the show's legacy that actually matters to him. It's a strange kind of afterlife for a television show, one built on a joke-heavy war comedy that was almost cancelled in its first year, fought its own network over a laugh track, lost 2 major cast members within a year of each other, and got interrupted by an actual wildfire near the end of its run. And yet more than 40 years after the cameras stopped rolling on that fictional army hospital, the show still resonates with new viewers discovering it for the first time, largely because it never pretended that laughter and grief were opposites. It insisted they belonged in the same room, sometimes the same scene, because that's what the people who actually lived through war told the writers was true. So the question worth sitting with is this: did Alan Alda's performance as Hawkeye Pierce quietly change the direction of American television more than almost any other single role of its era? And out of everything that happened across those 11 seasons, what's the one moment that has stayed with you the longest? Drop your answer in the comments, and if this kind of behind-the-scenes television history is something you want more of, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one.